When Jane Austen's novels were first published back in the early 1800s, the reading public of the day took to them with great enthusiasm. Her independent, spirited heroines fell in love with dashing, handsome, wealthy heroes of good character, and although the course of true love never ran smoothly, the outcome was always optimistic, with plenty of twists and turns in every tale. With the passage of time, Jane Austen became elevated to the lofty ranks of classic author, and for many years she was considered to be the province of students and academics. This is how things may well have remained, had it not been for a number of major film and television productions towards the end of the 20th century, when Jane Austen became a household name, as her novels, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Emma all received glamorous treatments and clever screenplays, as characters were brought to life and modern audiences captivated. Public perception of Jane Austen changed almost overnight. No longer was she reverently discussed in the hushed tones of literary circles. Viewers all over the world waited with bated breath to see if good would eventually triumph, with love and a handsome income conquering all. Storylines were surprisingly contemporary, and actors dressed in Regency splendour only added to the attraction. Ladies in low-cut necklines and gentlemen in figure-hugging breeches oozed passion, and suddenly Jane Austen, the modest daughter of an English country clergyman born in 1775, became the talking point of the day. A whole range of merchandise appeared in shops everywhere. Books were written about every aspect of Jane Austen's life, and one of the most interesting elements of her character to emerge was her great love of the English countryside. Throughout Jane Austen's novels, there are many spectacular views of English rural life, contrasted dramatically with fashionable town society, and tracing the great lady's footsteps offers an amazing picture of the rich and varied English landscape, both past and present. This programme has been designed to take you on a journey through Jane Austen's life and the places where she lived, holidayed, visited, and vividly immortalised in her novels. It often comes as a shock that Jane Austen only actually completed 6 novels, which are, in order of publication, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion, and Northanger Abbey, and compared to other great novelists such as Charles Dickens or Thomas Hardy, her output was certainly minimal. Consequently, the legacy she's left is all the more precious, and when you consider that she died at the tragically young age of 41, her potential as an author was never fully realised. However, for any viewer who has never read a Jane Austen novel, this is something of an advantage, because there are only 6 books to investigate, and we'll only touch on the elements which are relevant to following the Jane Austen trail. It's not only the novels that give us a view of Jane Austen's England, because a fine collection of letters also exists, predominantly between Jane and her sister Cassandra, giving fascinating information about everyday life for the Austen family. The letters were written on an almost daily basis, whenever the girls were parted, documenting their movements around the countryside, visiting the houses of friends and relations. Addresses vary from London to Bath, Kent to Lyme Regis, and the letters will be the basis of many of the locations that we'll visit throughout the course of this programme. As any good storyteller knows, the best place to start is at the beginning, and in this case, the first destination is Jane Austen's birthplace at Steventon in Hampshire. Steventon today is a tiny village, but at the time of Jane's birth, it was little more than a hamlet. The Reverend George Austen, Jane's father, was rector of Steventon and the lovely little church of St. Nicholas. He, his wife, and growing family lived in the nearby rectory, which was demolished way back in the 1820s, as it was thought to be unfit accommodation for a modern clergy family. But it was a home that, by all accounts, the Austens made very comfortable and welcoming. This is a sketch of Jane's childhood home, but it takes a degree of detective work to track down the site of the rectory, and this field is it. Now rich pasture, cattle often graze here, and the only visible remnant from the Austens' time in residence is the kitchen pump, gloriously overgrown, which once supplied the family's water. To get to the church at Steventon, and many thousands of visitors come each year to do just that, you actually pass this field, and few realise that it was here that Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December 1775. She was the seventh child, but only the second daughter, in what would eventually be a family of 8, and Jane was by no means the only sibling to achieve success. It was a busy household, and with 4 older brothers, not to mention the boys that the Reverend Austen took in as paying pupils to supplement the family's limited and inadequate income, Jane and her older sister Cassandra soon became inseparable. When Cassandra was to be sent away to school at Oxford, Jane was only 7 years old, but begged her mother to be allowed to go too. Mrs. Austen felt compelled to agree, remarking that,
"If Cassandra were going to have her head cut off, Jane would insist on sharing her fate."
There's little to see other than the pump, a scattering of elm trees, and a slope that Jane used to love to roll down as a child. But there's a lovely atmosphere that makes you want to linger a while in what is unquestionably some of the loveliest countryside to be found anywhere in the world. Closer inspection of the Church of St. Nicholas will definitely reveal more of the Austen connection. From the lovingly carved sign that gives details of services presided over by Jane at her writing desk, quill in hand, to the memorials inside, it's impossible to miss the homage paid to this parish's most famous daughter. There are also memorials to James, Jane's eldest brother, who's actually buried in the churchyard, who took over as rector here on his father's retirement. James also had literary ambitions, writing rather scholarly poetry, but it had none of the popular appeal of his sister's sparkling prose. He was a rather melancholy soul, who probably died a rather disappointed man. There are no such memorials to the next Austen to be born, George. He did live for a few years at the rectory, but because of a mental deficiency, he was boarded out with a local labouring family. It may have been a hereditary problem, as an uncle suffering with similar problems was also kept at the same house. This sounds callous by modern standards, but was considered normal practice at the time, and he outlived Jane by many years, surviving well into his 70s. Edward was born shortly after George, and his good fortune in life enabled Jane to move in high society, even if it was as a poor relation. Thomas Knight, a wealthy cousin of Jane's father, had helped improve the Austens' lot on a number of occasions. However, he and his wife were childless, and the Austens had more children than their meagre income could support. Consequently, when Edward was in his teens, he was adopted by the Knights as heir to their fortunes. Again, it seems callous if you apply today's values, but Edward's mother was convinced it was the right thing to do, even if his father was concerned about whether the boy would keep up his Latin.
"I think, my dear, you had better oblige your cousins and let the child go."
There were, of course, no snapshots for the family album in those days, but Edward's adoptive parents commissioned the silhouette you've been looking at to commemorate his arrival. Interestingly, the ladies do not interrupt their game to receive him. Nevertheless, the later portrait shows Edward grown into a fine young man, and he went on to inherit great wealth and status, proving himself to be well suited to the life of a country gentleman. Of all Jane's brothers, Henry, the next in line, was probably her favourite. Charming, self-confident, and optimistic, he was the entrepreneur of the family. When he and older brother James fell in love with the same girl, it was Henry, despite being 10 years her junior, that won her hand. With the house in London and a head for business, Henry was to prove helpful to Jane when it came to having her novels published. Unfortunately, his own ventures were not as successful as his sister's, and after facing bankruptcy, he lived out his days as a poor curate, a fate which he bore, by all accounts, with extraordinary cheerfulness. After Henry came Cassandra, the companion that would remain with Jane her whole life long. Ironically, of her two daughters, Mrs. Austen always considered Cassandra superior to Jane, in her own words,
"in all important respects."
This was no doubt due to Jane's painful shyness, which meant she preferred the protection of Cassandra's shadow to the glare of the limelight throughout her formative years. Between Cassandra and Jane came Frank, the first of the great seafaring Austens. Entering the Navy as a midshipman at the age of 14, he worked his way through the ranks until, at the remarkable age of 89, he was made Admiral of the Fleet and rewarded with a knighthood for services to king and country. Charles Austen, the baby of the family, also entered the Navy as a 14-year-old midshipman, rising to the rank of Rear Admiral. Although never quite as successful as Frank, it was nonetheless a fine achievement, but in fairness he didn't live as long as Frank, dying of cholera, serving off the coast of Burma, a mere youngster in his early 70s. Looking at the peaceful, tranquil scene at Steventon, and the tiny church that played such a huge role in the lives of each of the Austen children, it's incredible to think that so many of them rose to such significance in society in such very different ways. Life in the rectory was settled for many years, with Jane and Cassandra developing skills in writing and drawing respectively. Jane wrote this
History of England by a partial, prejudiced and ignorant historian
when she was just 15 years old, and Cassandra provided the humorous watercolour miniatures to illustrate it. The Austen girls were certainly attractive, described as
two of the prettiest girls in England, gaining hearts by the dozens.
Country balls and frequent social occasions gave them plenty of opportunity to meet prospective husbands, marriage being the only suitable occupation in life for girls of their social standing. Unfortunately for Jane and Cassandra, England had been at war with France since Jane was 17, and the majority of young men were away serving with the armed forces. Those who remained were often poor husband material, but even so, competition between so-called genteel young ladies was fierce. Jane had a brief flirtation with a handsome young Irishman of whom she had high hopes, but his family felt that the penniless daughter of a country parson was beneath his station in life. Although Cassandra fared better, becoming engaged to one of her father's former pupils, he died of yellow fever on an expedition to the West Indies. Being unlucky in love certainly gave Jane a wealth of experience to write about, and by the age of 20 she'd written her first attempt at a novel, Elinor and Marianne, later to be published as Sense and Sensibility. A year later she wrote First Impressions, which her father thought excellent, offering the novel for publication. It was flatly refused and returned unread, but it would re-emerge in later years as Pride and Prejudice. Jane's next literary attempt was inspired by a trip to Bath with sister Cassandra, and it told the story of a young country girl making her society debut in the city. The manuscript, entitled Susan, was sold to a publisher for £10, but ironically it was dismissed and did not appear in print until after Jane's death as Northanger Abbey. Without doubt, Jane Austen was a country woman at heart and described herself as proud to have been a
Hampshire-born Austen.
Consequently, when her father announced that he was retiring to Bath, Jane was appalled at the prospect that faced her. The city may have proved inspirational on a visit, but to live there? The idea was just too awful to contemplate, and Jane, not a young woman prone to fits of the vapours and swooning, fainted. It was Jane Austen's first experience of helplessness as a single female with no income. Her brothers had moved away to set up households of their own, leaving only the sisters at home with their parents at Steventon. The girls had no choice, and at the age of 25, Jane left the beloved countryside of her birth and headed for the city. If these thoughts from Jane reflected her true feelings, then we know that it was with a heavy heart that she accepted her fate.
The first view of Bath in fine weather does not answer my expectations. I think I see more distinctly through rain. The sun was behind everything, and the appearance of the place from the top of Kingsdown was all vapour, shadow, smoke and confusion.
As a famous author, Jane Austen's name is frequently connected with Bath, but few realise just how much she disliked the elegant city. Apart from the fact that she loved the country, the years spent in Bath coincided with a very unsettled period in Jane Austen's life. For the first time, she experienced real financial insecurity. The Austens at Steventon had never been wealthy, but they'd lived in the rectory rent-free and grown most of their own food. To buy produce in Bath was extremely expensive, and also the house that the Austens settled for in the city was both fashionable and pleasant, but it did stretch their limited income. When the lease was up on the property some 3 years later, they moved to poorer lodgings, which had been rejected on their arrival in Bath as too low-lying and damp. It was, without a doubt, a step backwards socially, and the Austens' problems were compounded just a few months later when the Reverend George Austen died, quite suddenly leaving the Austen ladies almost penniless. For Jane, losing her beloved father was a terrible blow, and from this point onwards, Bath was always linked to this tragic episode.
We have lost our excellent father. An illness of only 48 hours carried him off yesterday morning. It has been very sudden. Within 24 hours of his death he was walking with only the help of a stick, was even reading. His tenderness as a father, who can do justice to? The serenity of the corpse is most delightful. It preserves the sweet, benevolent smile which always distinguished him.
There were a further 2 moves to even sadder lodgings in the city, before the ladies moved to Southampton to share a house with Jane's brother Frank and his family. Frank was away in the Navy, and his wife was pregnant, so the arrangement was also advantageous to him, as he could leave his wife in the care of his mother and sisters. It was with great relief that Jane took her leave of Bath, and considering what had befallen her there, it was hardly surprising. However, despite what Jane Austen may have felt about the city, Bath truly is beautiful, and for the many thousands of visitors who come here today, there's a great deal of interest to see. In happier circumstances, Jane Austen herself may well have viewed things differently. Ironically, it was one of Jane Austen's distant relations, the Duke of Chandos, who instigated the rebuilding of Bath in such glorious style. He came to take the spa waters for his health in 1727, and saw a wonderful opportunity for redevelopment. With a vision of creating a new Roman city, the Duke brought in architect and builder John Wood to realise his dream. Expanding out from the stunning abbey and the original Roman baths, Queen Square, Gay Street, and Wood's Piece de Resistance, the circus, all quickly grew to grace the city's landscape. His good work was continued by his son, another John Wood, who built the famous Royal Crescent. a great architect of the time, Robert Adam, was responsible for the beautiful Pulteney Bridge, which links the city centre via Great Pulteney Street with the new elegant developments which sprang up on the other side of the river during Jane Austen's stay in the city. Bath rapidly grew into a fashionable watering hole, and the cream of society flocked in. The 18th century pump rooms built above the Roman baths became a popular meeting place, and for the modern-day visitor it's still possible to drink the waters, taken from a hot spring which rises from the ground at 47 degrees centigrade. Fortunately, it tastes quite pleasant, unlike some of the other spa waters around the country, which can taste absolutely disgusting. Whatever Jane Austen thought of Bath, it was certainly a considerable source of inspiration for her writing. There was also one other advantage that was to be had from moving to the city. During the hot summer months, the Austen family would spend long holidays in the West Country to avoid the heat. The sea air was also a tonic for Jane Austen's spirits, and visits to Sidmouth, Dawlish, Teignmouth and Lyme Regis were always much appreciated. Just as Bath had unhappy associations for Jane, the seaside certainly seemed to inspire more pleasant, uplifting thoughts. This is Lyme Regis, which Jane Austen used to contrast with the stuffiness of Bath in her novel Persuasion. The Cobb, which is still a much-visited landmark today, had a dramatic role to play in Jane's story, as one of her female characters is rather too reckless and slips whilst jumping down from the wall, falling unconscious. The beach and the lovely walks around over the hills to Charmouth are pretty much unchanged, and as a seaside resort, Lyme Regis still has a charming oldie-world atmosphere. Jane's words about Lyme Regis hold as true today as they did in Persuasion all those years ago.
The remarkable situation of the town, the principal street almost hurrying into the water, the walk to the Cobb skirting around the pleasant little bay, which in the season is animated with bathing machines and company, the Cobb itself, its old wonders and new improvements, with a very beautiful line of cliffs stretching out to the east of the town, are what the stranger's eye will seek. And a very strange stranger it must be who does not see charms in the immediate environment of Lyme to make him wish to know it better.
There may, however, have been a very special reason for Jane's fond memories of one particular summer spent by the sea. Looking at the few portraits that exist of Jane Austen coupled with descriptions of her as an attractive young lady with a lively personality, it seems unusual that she didn't marry. And if this next story is anything to go by, it was misfortune rather than lack of opportunity that prevented this. It was many years after Jane's death that her sister Cassandra told the tale of a romantic seaside encounter with a mystery admirer, which took place on a summer tour of the West Country while the Austens were residents of Bath. Cassandra evidently approved of the young man, describing him as worthy of Jane, and the attraction was reported as being mutual. Unfortunately, the budding attachment was cut short, as the gentleman was called away, but arrangements were made to meet up again with the sisters later on their tour. fate dealt a cruel blow, and the next information that was forthcoming was news of his death. Sad as the conclusion to this liaison may have been, the romance of the seaside remained important to Jane Austen for the rest of her life, frequently cropping up in her writing in very positive fashion. The clock was ticking for Jane, young men were in short supply, and any hopes of matrimony that she might have had were fading fast. A short time after the incident with the mystery admirer, Jane and Cassandra were visiting with friends at Steventon. The younger brother of the household, then aged 21, proposed to Jane, 6 years his senior. They were a well-to-do family, and the marriage would have provided Jane with a secure and comfortable future, and she accepted. By the next morning, however, she'd changed her mind, and after rejecting her young suitor, returned home to Bath immediately. We know from Jane Austen's novels that she was very much ahead of her time, with a view that marriage should be for love or not at all. And perhaps, despite the advantages being offered her, it was the knowledge that she didn't love the young man that made her turn him down. It was as if Jane was aware that this was her last chance to marry and have a family of her own, because from this point on she became more settled with her lot as a single woman, and contented herself with being a much-loved aunt. Once away from Bath, although the period of time spent at Southampton was a little grim, the Austen ladies began to come to terms with their grief and diminished circumstances. Then an opportunity arose that was to change their lives very much for the better. Brother Edward, who'd been adopted by rich relations, had come into his own as a wealthy gentleman, with a number of fine properties and estates. One of his estates was at Chawton in Hampshire, where a short distance from the great house stood Chawton Cottage, a substantial red brick building at the heart of the village, and it was this property that he offered to his mother and sisters rent-free. The fact that Chawton is only about 15 miles away from Steventon made this move even more perfect, as Jane could at last return to the beloved countryside of her birth. So begins the most important chapter in the life of the writer Jane Austen. In July 1809, at the age of 33, probably quietly resigned to spinsterhood, Jane moved into Chawton Cottage, which she described in glowing terms in a letter to Brother Frank.
As for ourselves, we're very well, as unaffected prose will tell. Our Chawton home, how much we find already in it to our mind, and how convinced that when complete it will all other houses beat.
Today, Chawton Cottage still stands in the middle of this lovely Hampshire village, and as the new nameboard displays for all to see, the alternative title, Jane Austen's House, this is a very special location for anyone tracing the great lady's footsteps. Although Jane Austen departed this house in 1817, it truly is just as it was in her day, giving the impression that she might well walk back in through a whitewashed door at any moment. There are reports of Jane Austen's ghost walking through this house, but the reasons for such a strong link to the past are far more tangible. There are many personal items here that belonged to the Austen family, which have been returned to the museum. A lock of Jane's hair still glimmers with traces of auburn, and the topaz crosses given to Jane and Cassandra by their brother Charles are on display. The Hepplewhite bureau bookcase belonged to the Reverend George Austen, and along with the accompanying chairs came from the rectory at Steventon. There's a patchwork quilt sewn by Mrs. Austen, Jane and Cassandra, alongside a fine collection of Jane's own books and first editions of her novels. However, pride of place goes to the little writing table, set with writing paper and quill, where all of her great novels were completed. It's one sure sign that Jane's spirits improved when she left Bath, because she started to write again. For all her time in residence in the city, only a few letters exist from before she settled in Sydney Place, and just one from Lyme Regis in 1804. Her literary efforts were equally barren, with no further manuscripts completed. By the time Jane reached the peace and comfort of Chawton Cottage, she was ready to take up her quill again in earnest. Life was simple for the Austen ladies of Chawton Cottage, with routine and order governing their lives. Cassandra had taken on the housekeeping responsibilities, with Jane being responsible for making the breakfast of tea and toast. Jane loved to play the piano, particularly when she was alone, and would begin her day before the other residents rose at her music. These music books are Jane's own handwritten manuscripts, and they've been used in recent years to make authentic recordings of the kind of music Jane enjoyed, and indeed make up the soundtrack of this programme. Jane was delighted with Chawton, not least because she could have a piano again, as on leaving Steventon for Bath, her piano had been sold.
Yes, we will have a pianoforte, as good a one as I can get for 30 guineas, and I will practise country dances, that we may have some amusement for our nephews and nieces when we have the pleasure of their company.
This 1810 Chimenti piano that can be seen today in the museum is a perfect example of the type of instrument Jane would have purchased for her 30 guineas. After music and breakfast, Jane would have been free to take up her writing. Only her immediate family and friends knew of her novel writing, as, if callers arrived, she would carefully conceal her manuscripts. This door still creaks to this day, and Jane would never allow it to be oiled, as the tell-tale squeak would warn her of imminent disturbance, allowing her vital seconds to hide her work away. value of fresh air was also truly appreciated in the Austen household, and although the ladies of Chawton weren't able to afford to keep a carriage themselves, Brother Edward provided this now perfectly restored donkey carriage for the family to use. It meant that they could visit a fairly wide circle of acquaintance, and of course the great house at Chawton, when Edward and his family were in residence. The church here in Chawton is lovely, and it's the place where ruined Brother Henry served out his days as a poor country curate. Both Mrs. Austen and Cassandra are buried side by side in this beautifully kept little churchyard, and for anyone passing this way, it's well worth a visit. When Jane Austen arrived at Chawton, it had been some years since she'd sold her manuscript, Susan, for publication. Once she knew that the move back to Hampshire was arranged, she wrote to the tardy publisher, inquiring about its progress. Jane was rather affronted when he suggested she buy it back, and took matters no further, turning her attention instead to transforming Eleanor and Marianne into Sense and Sensibility. The atmosphere at Chawton proved pleasantly productive, and the novel, now famous the world over, was published anonymously by a lady in 1811. Next came Pride and Prejudice, telling the great love story of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Many think that Mr. Darcy's grand estate, Pemberley in Derbyshire, was inspired by a visit Jane Austen made to Chatsworth on a tour of the area. Pride and Prejudice appeared in print in 1813, with Jane referring to it as her own darling child, and was concerned about how it might be received.
I must confess that I think Elizabeth Bennet as delightful a creature as ever appeared in print, and how I shall be able to tolerate those who do not like her, at least, I do not know.
Jane needn't have worried. The reading public adored Elizabeth, and Pride and Prejudice was a huge success. The next novel, Mansfield Park, published in 1814, was not so popular, although it was the first to be composed in its entirety at Chawton. The heroine, Fanny Price, is a very good sort, and to this day it is true to say that readers love her or hate her. There's just no middle ground with Fanny Price. There's also a fine naval feel to the book, influenced strongly by the tales reported back from brothers Frank and Charles. Jane was disappointed with the handling of Mansfield Park and changed publisher when Emma came into print in 1815. Jane was yet again adventurous with her leading lady, describing her as
a heroine whom no one but myself will much like.
The novel was nevertheless a great success, and Emma Woodhouse is as popular today as ever. There is, however, an interesting story connected with Emma, which may well have substantially increased the readership. Quite unexpectedly, when Jane Austen was staying in London with her brother Henry, she received a visit from a royal emissary. His Royal Highness, the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, had heard that Miss Austen was in London, and, as an admirer of her work, invited her to visit the library at Carlton House, his London residence. The messenger was James Stanier Clark, the rather opinionated librarian who offered Jane advice on novel writing. The incident provoked Jane to reply with one of her most famous letters, explaining why she was unworthy of his attentions.
I think I may boast myself to be, with all possible vanity, the most unlearned and uninformed female who ever dared to be an authoress.
Jane may well have been flattered that the future king admired her work, especially as she was still writing anonymously. But she was faced with a dilemma when Mr. Stanier Clark informed her that the prince had given his permission for her to dedicate Emma to him. It was impossible for Jane to decline the honour without causing great offence, but she really took a very dim view of the Prince Regent and his scandalous womanising and gambling. At one stage, his wife, the Princess of Wales, had complained about his treatment of her in a letter to the newspapers, and Jane left us in no doubt about her opinion of the prince when she read it.
I suppose all the world is sitting in judgment upon the Princess of Wales's letter. Poor woman, I shall support her as long as I can, because she is a woman, and because I hate her husband.
Harsh words from Jane, but the dedication was duly made as directed, and the success of the novel was assured. By the time Jane Austen had completed work on her next novel, Persuasion, her health was beginning to deteriorate rapidly. Over the ensuing months, Jane suffered terribly, often in excruciating pain, with no relief whatsoever. Her doctor was a well-respected physician based in Winchester, some miles from Chawton, and he suggested that his patient move to Winchester so he could give more regular care. There was nothing else for it, and in May 1817, Jane Austen and her faithful sister Cassandra left their Chawton home for lodgings here at 8 College Street, Winchester. The house is situated in the shadow of the great cathedral, and despite the good doctor's best efforts, Jane became weaker by the day. As the plaque on the wall shows all too clearly, Jane's fight for life was a brief one. Jane Austen died on the 18th of July 1817, at the age of 41, in the arms of her beloved sister. Cassandra was left to mourn Jane and watch the tragic burial procession to Winchester Cathedral, Jane's final resting place. These words sum up Cassandra's terrible personal loss.
I have lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as never can be surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. I had not a thought concealed from her, and it is as if I had lost a part of myself.
The cause of Jane's death is still something of a mystery, as no one is altogether sure what killed her. There are those who believe Addison's disease, a disorder affecting the adrenal glands, was the cause of her demise, but it may well equally have been some form of cancer. Whatever, with none of the medical advances that are available today, Jane Austen's death would, without doubt, have been painful and drawn out, not only for her, but for those that loved her so dearly, as the agony of watching Jane and her genius fading away must have been appalling. Winchester Cathedral is a magnificent piece of architecture, but there's nothing grand about Jane Austen's memorial stone, a simple but poignant slab on the floor of the north aisle in the nave. And who can say how many people walk across Jane Austen's mortal remains without even realising that she's there? A brass plaque can be found on the wall above it, and there are always helpful cathedral guides on hand to point anyone searching for Jane Austen's grave in the right direction. Fortunately, before Jane's death, the completed manuscript of Persuasion had been placed in Henry Austen's capable hands, who'd also secured the return of the manuscript of Susan, sold all those years before for £10, never to see the light of day again. Jane reworked the novel and completed it as Northanger Abbey. She was particularly delighted that Henry had conveniently forgotten to mention that the disregarded manuscript was an early offering from the pen of the much-acclaimed author of Pride and Prejudice, and the price agreed to buy Susan back had been nominal. It would perhaps have been a pleasant irony for Jane Austen that the disobliging publisher who'd snubbed her work had lost out on Northanger Abbey. Both Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were published together under Henry's care in December 1817, and for the very first time Jane Austen's name appeared in print as the author. The rest is, of course, history, and the days of Jane Austen being perceived as exclusively the province of dusty academics is thankfully long gone. Many new generations of readers have discovered the delights of her novels and will continue to do so for generations to come. However, this programme has highlighted an even greater story, that of Jane Austen herself, and the beautiful English countryside that she loved so well and immortalised in her writing. There are those who have criticised her own particular brand of parochialism, notably the author D.H. Lawrence, when he described Jane Austen as thoroughly unpleasant, English in the bad, mean, snobbish sense of the word. But really, you only have to see with your own eyes the landscape of her imagination to find fault with this statement. The England Jane Austen portrays is the England that she knew, and love what she did or hate it, the novels have been left as a fascinating snapshot of a particular moment in time. Fortunately, many of the places that inspired Jane Austen have also been left untouched, and for the modern-day traveller seeking to follow in her footsteps, the rewards will hopefully, during the course of this programme, have spoken for themselves.